unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan and Ravinder. By now, we are all familiar with the catchphrases, colorful billboards, and slick branding. Incredible India. India shining, make in India, new India. But these are not just the frivolous creations of marketing executives and tourist brochures. They are the stuff of 21st century nation branding. This is the argument of a brand new book by the scholar Ravinder Kaur, Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs in 21st Century India. Ravinder is a professor of modern South Asian studies at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm pleased to welcome her to the show for the very first time. Ravinder, good to see you.
Thank you so much.
I want to start out by congratulating you. For there are listeners who may not know, Martin Wolf, who I think is one of the most eloquent economics commentators of our era, of the Financial Times, he recently awarded your book one of his favorite economic books of 2020. And I'm just curious, how did you hear the news and kind of what was your immediate reaction?
I actually received the news from a colleague in the US. So I was quite surprised. And given the fact that I'm a historian anthropologist and my book to be included in the category of economics, I was actually quite happy and overjoyed that economics is being thought about in the broader terms, like it should always have been, that this is not about number crunching, that economics is to do with a much broader field of society. So I think in that sense, I was very happy.
It was a very eclectic list, and I was very pleased. And it reminded me to drop you a line to get in touch with you because, you know, the subject of your book is an incredibly timely one. And I want to begin this conversation by linking to an observation you make early on in the book. And I think it kind of sets up the overall framework for the book. And I just want to quote a selection here where you write, India's embrace of liberal economic reforms in the early 1990s was not merely an instance of liberal triumphalism sweeping the globe. It also signified an end of the third world vision that India had helped shape in the heady years of independence, end quote. I'm wondering, just as a kind of setup for our listeners, what was this third world vision you speak of that India seems to have been kind of shattering with these 1991 economic reforms?
So I think this is a very good question, actually. That to think about the third world vision, this was a lot to do with the economic vision. Now, if we recall that much of the anti-colonial struggle had economic independence as one of the key demands. And even after, and here I'm referring to the ideas of Swadeshi or the effort to be self-reliant. And in many ways, what Gandhi was talking about in today's very contemporary language, we would be speaking about degrowth. So all of this is rechanneled in the post-colonial era in what came to be bundled as new international economic order, or at least this was the wish of the post-colonial nations, to have some sort of level playing field with the industrialized nations, because the drive was to escape dependence. So I think, and we must remember that all of this is taking place during the Cold War era, where the post-colonial nations are trying to forge their own path without aligning with the capitalist world or the communist world. So in that sense, when India, which is actually one of the leaders of NAM and Bandung, it goes on, it's one of those countries which first takes a plunge and reluctantly embraces the reforms. It is shifting the dynamic, as we all know. It has since shifted the dynamic.
So as we think about where India is today, you talk about this concept of the brand new nation, and you define that as that of a nation revitalized and renewed as a profitable business enterprise with claims to ownership over cultural property within its territory. And you note, I think quite provocatively, that 20th century nation building increasingly has been replaced and substituted by 20th century nation branding. So paint us a picture of what kind of India's 20th century post-liberalization branding looks like to you. How do you characterize it?
I think perhaps one should begin by saying that branding is merely the surface. It is merely what we witness. And the most important thing is what is happening beneath. So the phenomena that I'm trying to refer to is that we begin to conceive of the nation, the entire nation state, basically, as an income generating asset. So it's a new kind of vision, economic, like thinking about the nation in economic terms. And here, territory is seen as potential natural resources which can be tapped. Or people come to be defined as human capital, or in India's case, the term which became very popular was demographic dividend. And that was something also all over the place. It is one of the key points that India wants to show that India has one of the youngest populations, a large labor force. Or for that matter, to think about culture as something which is something which can help you differentiate from Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, because everybody is trying to open themselves up as a potential investment destination. So suddenly, culture is not something, an add-ons. Culture is something you can invoke to define yourself as a brand. So I think this is the phenomena that I'm trying to refer to. And of course, it is more than, as I said, branding is merely the surface. It has actually realigned, reconfigured the nation state altogether. To think about that India is a federal, India is a federal nation state. And people for long talked about federal collaboration, but here actually the new concepts which have come about are, for example, federal competitiveness. That a state like Gujarat is trying to compete with West Bengal, or Punjab is competing with Tamil Nadu. Each and every state in India, by the way, actually has its own branding or investment program. So the whole dynamic is actually shifted as to, there are indexes within India, the cleanest city or earns the most revenue and whatnot. So what I'm trying to point to is a different kind of logic which has come to reshape the nation, even though it looks the same to us.
So there's a deeper a meta point, Ravinder, I think, buried within this, which is, and you explicitly bring this out in the book, which is sort of could I characterize as the revenge of the nation state, right? I mean, there was a lot of literature and political science, as you know, talking about fragmentation of power, the rise of capital, the rise of civil society, the rise of transnational groups. But what you're seeing here is a reassertion of sovereignty of the nation state, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes when we go back and begin to read the literature which was produced in the early 1990s, it is like mind-boggling, because one is like, as you know, the whole language of describing the world is of movements and flows and connections and linkages. Somebody like Thomas Friedman, he writes about the world is flat. I mean, I don't need to name all those, things which have formed our ideas. But what I'm trying to show is that in the middle of all that, like, including scholars, like, people got carried away with this idea that, we live in this flat cosmopolitan world. Because the phenomena which I'm pointing out to you, namely the nation branding or the reformation of the nation as an investment destination, this is actually happening in 1990s. Few people pay attention to the fact that 1990s new economic policy in India actually had image makeover as one of the key components. But it is totally overlooked, because when we speak about structural adjustments, people are speaking about, many of, they like this number crunching thing. But the thing is, in the soft, affective, emotional arena, something far more significant is taking place, which is making all of us ready, the citizens, the bureaucrats, policymakers, to conceive of the nation as something which can also produce income. And you have pointed out about sovereignty. The logic obviously is that more foreign development, foreign investments pour into the nation more it is seen as a form of recognition of the nation as well. And you can see that whenever the current government is in trouble, they always point out to, but you see, the foreign investments are flowing in, you know? So I think that logic, we must remember that foreign investments, money pouring in, that actually is a form of recognition, legitimization, or acknowledging the sovereignty of the state, that it has control over all these assets, territory, natural resources. It can give you mining contracts, or it can lay open anything, so it's a different kind of contract that we are witnessing, which I'm trying to point out, the economic rationalization which goes on.
One of the most fascinating chapters of the book is when you explore who exactly the makers of this brand new nation of the 21st century are. And you kind of locate these individuals in the domain of quote unquote anti-politics, right? So these are apolitical, largely technocratic figures. They explicitly maintain a kind of arm's length distance from politics. Tell us more about who these, brand makers are. Where are they located in the kind of governmental power structure, and what gives them their power?
Uh, I have to say that, someone who, like all of us who have read lessons in Indian history, we are used to thinking of the makers of the nation mainly as political figures, political by, political activists, political leaders. But in this case, the people I was meeting in the field, actually, none of them were politicians. And the interesting thing is that, this anti-politics or anti-political stance is not something I made up. I mean, they would themselves say that we are apolitical. And they would always, this is how they would introduce themselves as, people who are committed to the service of the nation. And I think which also creates a certain kind of tension between a very commercial enterprise and at the same time talking about a selfless nationalist cause. And the beautiful part of this, or very interesting part, is that many bureaucrats or actually politicians that I would meet, they would go out of their way to describe themselves as CEOs. I mean, not they themselves. I mean, this is something, it's almost kind of an honorific, title which is bestowed. I'm not going to name the people. I've anonymized everyone, but these are very well-known figures that I'm mentioning in my book. So if you can play a little jumble, you can figure out who those people are. And they would often be introduced as CEOs. And by CEOs, I learned basically what they meant to say was that they bring some ethics or some sort of efficiency from the private sector, which the government lacks.
I mean, that, and by the way, I should just interject, was very much part of the appeal of Prime Minister Modi when he made the jump from Gujarat chief minister to prime minister in 2013 and 2014, right? Was trying to campaign on the back of a kind of CEO-like ethos, saying, I have gotten the state to function in a more efficient manner with better governance and a more hospitable investment climate. And if you bring my party to power, I promise to do that on a nationwide scale, right?
You're totally right. And I think but I have to say that it wasn't Mr. Modi who is the first CEO of India, because that mantle was already taken by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And that is the first time we begin encountering that there is the Prime Minister of the country begins to be called CEO. Actually, there are books published with such titles at that time. And I think what came naturally to Mr. Manmohan Singh was that he wasn't a politician.
Right.
But he was an economist. So somehow, like he comes with a certain kind of expert authority, which politicians lack. So we must also recognize that there is a wider context within which this is taking place. And this whole idea that, government has no business to be in business, right? So this whole notion that somehow government is the, symbolic of red tape, and it is stopping development of the nation. Among the people, the nation branders that I'm speaking about, this was deeply rooted. And they basically were almost allergic to politicians or anyone, closely connected. So I think this field here, suddenly this public-private, distinctions that we operate in within political theory, it doesn't work at all. Because this is a new formation taking place where people who work for the government, they don't want to be seen as government, bureaucrats. And people who are in the private sector, they are saying, no, but we are doing it for the nationalist cause. you know. So I think this is the new field which is emerging, which is literally people by technocrats, policymakers, designers, advertisers, a completely different set of people. So I think the makers of this India are of a different variety.
So Ravinder, I have to bring this conversation to Davos, this idyllic mountain town in Switzerland, which is the home, of course, of the annual gathering of the World Economic Forum. You describe in vivid terms, because you went there, the ways in which, quote unquote, brand India was plastered everywhere, right? You see it on the sides of buses, and you have pictures, I should mention, in the book of many of these instances, to the sides of buildings, hotels, hoardings, happy hours. For those who have not ever been to Davos, myself included, tell us a little bit about kind of what I would describe as almost like a love affair between, on the one hand, nationalist aspirations and capitalist kind of dreamscapes. What does that actually look like? Here you are, Ravinder Kaur, the scholar, you show up in Davos to paint us a picture of, what are you taking in?
Well, I have to say that first of all, Davos clusters. I mean, these are two ski resorts for the rich people, and these are old establishments. And sometimes in 1980s, 70s, 80s, World Economic Forum, which begins as actually a business enterprise in Zurich, they decide to move to Davos, and it's a village. It's a village with fancy cafes and shops and whatnot. But during that week, every year in January, which is the third week of January, it is transformed into a different kind of marketplace. And that's what I'm trying to describe, because the same outlets which would normally function as shops or cafes, they are rented out at very high prices, actually, to different governments, national governments. So when you walk through the street, which is called Promenade, it is literally like in West Egypt or Malaysia, truly Asia, or, in India, like South Africa, and then you get puzzled. What on earth is going on? There are so many countries, all BRIC countries, by the way, are majorly present over there. And so I think what you witness over here is that surprisingly, in this very flat world of global capitalism, suddenly national identities become tremendously important. Because how is Malaysia going to pitch itself differently from South Africa, or India from Brazil, or Egypt, and so on and so forth? So this is contrary to everything that we have learned about the global capitalist era thus far. It is precisely those national cultural differences that begin to take root. And here, I have to say, the fieldwork that I've made, and I've been not once, but a few more times, you are sitting among India's billionaires. Or, it's a small place, so you still go to restaurants. I mean, you have to eat in the same places, So this is where you see something quite interesting happening, where the capitalist class of India becomes they basically speak the language of anti-colonialism. Often they speak about that, we are beating the, global capital at their own game by buying their companies, or basically the fact that Indian capital is so, majorly present in such a global space is seen as that they are forging ahead with the Indian nationalist cause. So it seems like contrary to the whole notion of globalization versus nationalism, but this is where it makes a very strange kind of unlikely alliance.
I want to ask you about the case of India shining. This is a really interesting historical case, which you go into some detail about. Most of us remember this from the early 2000s as the failed slogan of the BJP's 2004 re-election campaign, in which the incumbent government of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee was defeated, making way for the first of these two terms by the Congress-led Manmohan Singh government. Take us back to the kind of early 2000s. Where did this idea, this branding idea of the India shining come from? And why do you think it flopped so badly? I mean, certainly the perception is out there that this was a political disaster for the incumbent BJP.
So I think it was a disaster only when you think in electoral terms, in the sense that BJP government lost the election. So, which is why people started talking about that the government has lost election because of the India Shining campaign. But what I'm trying to show by tracing back, going back into 2003 and 4, is that yes, the government may have collapsed, but the idea of India shining or the neoliberal reforms actually gained strength. And this, for to make sense of this seemingly contradictory thing, we also have to go back to the counter campaign which was launched by the Congress government, which in Hindi the campaign was called "Aam Aadmi Ko Kya Mila," which basically means what did the common man get. So basically, what I'm trying to show is that the very language of what do you get, what is your share, that actually points to that by now, after 10 12 years of economic reforms, the idea that India must generate growth has become commonplace. So no one is actually contesting that anymore. By the time, the idea is, but what am I getting out of it? What is my share of this? So I think this is one way to understand that the logic of belonging to the nation state is no longer just that I belong to this nation or citizenship. The very idea of citizenship also is that what is my share in this, what am I investing, and what are my returns on that investment. And I think India Shining was tremendously interesting because it was actually launched by the Ministry of Finance, and it was launched basically to give a jolt to the Indian middle class primarily, because the idea is that Indian middle class usually hoards a lot of money in the form of gold, dead assets. And if only those dead assets would be brought back into the economy, that circulation, that they would, more growth would be stimulated. And by the time, growth has started rising. And this campaign was launched primarily for the Indian audience to say that, look, India is doing very well. Why don't you join the celebration, and why don't you invest in India too? And this is the idea of investor citizen that I'm trying to bring up, that it is no longer just the foreign companies which are coming and investing. The citizen, the entire citizenry is being invited to also invest in India. So what seems like a fiasco, and indeed it was a fiasco in terms of electoral terms, but at the same time, the idea, the logic that we must also grow, that I must also grow, that has become commonplace. And what I'm also trying to say is that, you see, by the time, there are not many alternatives being offered, that what else can be there? If not growth, then what else can be the solution? So scan through all those old reports, and you don't find many, and this includes the Communist Party of India, by the way. Even those commentators, I mean, they are speaking about distribution. They're not actually questioning the model of growth.
One of the things that's happening in parallel, Ravinder, and you get into this in the book as well, is this new kind of emerging markets grouping, which became embedded, I think, in all of our popular imagination of this kind of what I think is a kind of contrived designation of the BRICs, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. Sometimes the S stands for South Africa, although I don't think it was originally part of the formulation. This was a term coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs banker Jim O'Neill. When I think about this in retrospect, here we are in 2020, I question how much resonance this term has anymore in the current political era. I mean, of course, these countries have, in some sense, taken very different paths. We now see, China and India fighting a hot war, basically on the border. Obviously, developments in Russia have gone their own way. Tell us a little bit about this kind of imagination of the BRICS, and do you think that it has any currency any longer?
I think it is losing its currency because BRICS is symbolic. Actually, it comes about precisely at a time when the idea of emerging markets has taken root. An emerging markets idea is it has a much longer history. Already from 1980s onwards, it becomes popularized. So BRICS or BRIC or BRICS is something which is addressing the financial markets to say that, look, there are new investment hotspots where you can also make money, that the old third world is not just a hopeless case, you can also generate income there. And as we know, every major and minor investment bank or banks in general, they started having emerging market funds. Every bank has that. And funds begin to be channeled. And at the same time, the movement of money, capital, also meant that that the political power of these countries as a group which could negotiate also grew. And that also took shape of something called IBSA, which sought to become at least some sort of again a political collective. But by now we see, and especially during the pandemic, the fractures which have always been there within this grouping, they have actually become very prominent, and mostly it has to do with China. And I think maybe we must pay attention to the fact that on one hand we have this whole Indo-Pacific question, and on the other side we have this RCEP, the biggest trade deal which has been made, and which incidentally includes two members of the Indo-Pacific, Australia and Japan also, which basically means that the whole scene, the geopolitical, geoeconomic scene, is pretty much in flux. That if the idea, the older idea of third world, of NAM, as this collective which is going to negotiate with the industrialized world, that had taken root with G77 and so on. And then it becomes BRICs. And now we are speaking that a very fractured kind of scene where we have Indo-Pacific, which is taking place on one hand, and on the other hand, this regional comprehensive economic treaty. So I think I do not see how BRICS can become that collective that it wanted to become, especially given the position of China, which is increasingly seen with a lot of suspicion and hostility in many parts of the world.
I want to link back to something that we spoke about a couple minutes ago on this issue of growth in GDP figures. One of the things I think the book does so well is it helps us understand how and why data, these new global rankings, they play such a large role in defining what this brand new nation is about, right? And so you write at one point, quote, "If there is a showstopper in this routine spectacle of market attractiveness, it comes in the unlikely form of cold numbers, GDP growth rates and global business rankings," end quote. India has had, particularly in the last several years, a rather contested relationship with the GDP league tables, as you know, as well as these global rankings like the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, which is probably the best known. What I'm struck by is when there are criticisms lodged, for instance, of India's GDP numbers and how the method of recalculation, the method of backcasting old numbers, or criticisms of how the World Bank's index is constructed, whether or not India has gamed the system, and so on and so forth, there is a ferocity of response, a ferociousness of the response coming from government entities. And you see this on social media, you see this in press statements, you see this in press conferences. Why is it the case that these somewhat arbitrary figures have become so central to the kind of crafting of India's image, not just externally, but also for domestic audiences as well?
I think this is the logic of the brand new nation, where growth or growth numbers become so central to the identity. Because what I've been trying to argue is that much of that identity rests on the ability to generate growth. So GDP, of course, is a measure of that. And of course, everyone knows that GDP, it is heavily criticized, the methods, the ways in which, and GDP, what does it even tell us? GDP basically is a sum all of, the entire production and consumption in a nation. And leaving aside the bigger debates, the thing is that it is especially central, the growth rates in India. In India, GDP, in internal politics, I'm not speaking about the world. World pays less attention to what India's GDP is than what happens in India. And the government actually is really, I mean, not just Modi government, successive governments have been extremely focused on GDP numbers, and which basically means that the focus is so badly on improving the ranking or a particular number that all kind of data, is kind of like the focus is on how can we improve our ranking. So the point here probably is about the notion that we need to generate good news all the time, and GDP or higher numbers become a signal of good news. Something like India is doing pretty well, and the efficiency of the government is constantly measured on that how well they have performed. And as you know, during the pandemic, when the news came that India's GDP has been sliding down very badly, nearly a quarter, of the GDP is like lost, and now we are in negative numbers and quite likely a recession. So that is actually seen as a performance report card. So how is the CEO of this company doing? How profitable is this company? So I think in that sense, no one really understands what GDP figures are all about or how they're calculated, but the number itself becomes literally the fetishized object of public debate.
I mean, one of the things that this links to is this conversation, which is everywhere in India today, about this idea of a new India, right? The Prime Minister talks about it a lot. He talks about it in terms of his vision for better sanitation and potable water. He talks about the need to construct a new India in reference to India's role abroad, not as a balancing power, but a leading power. He talks about it in terms of his vision for a $5 trillion economy by the year 2024. It is a constant trope in his speeches and across his social media accounts. You note in the book that this idea of a new India is not very new. In fact, it goes back to the 91 reforms. What I found totally interesting and had no knowledge of is that it actually goes back to developments in the mid-19th century. Tell us a little bit about this past, I think, relatively unknown life of this concept of the new India.
I mean, I think I have to say it was exactly the same for me when I began doing this research, and I would, get into the archives, and I would expect everything from 1990s to come up. And instead, I began reading documents from the mid-19th century, and it was a great puzzle for me as well. And what you could see, obviously, I mean, then, of course, I begin tracing the shifts, like how the idea of new or novelty, that how that has been produced in different ways over, a century and a half or so. And the origin of this term, when people begin to speak about renewal of India, that was much to do with that we are, that India is becoming part of the empire. And much like a lot of times, New India was pitted against, a part which is governed by, which is under the imperial rule versus the princely states, because princely states were seen as a little bit more, feudal and backward, whereas now this new India is moving towards modernity because it is plugged into the world economy through the imperial route. And that was one notion. And at the same time, we must not forget that 19th century is also the age of social reforms, that modernity was also expressed in such ways. And these are colonial enterprises. And then, of course, New India was also a terminology with freedom fighters, activists who are demanding independence. They are also using this. And there is this whole lot of literature. Actually, there was a newspaper produced at the turn of the century, last century, called New India as well. And by the time, of course, when Jawaharlal Nehru makes a speech in the midnight in August 1947, he is indeed speaking about the birth of New India, right? But then 90s come, and by the time it is no longer about political freedoms, we are speaking about economic freedoms. And this is something which is expressed on and on and off about as the second independence struggle or the second liberation, where it is no longer the political freedoms but economic freedoms that we are speaking about. So I think these are the shifts that New India continues to evolve into.
I want to bring this conversation to a close by asking you to reflect on something that comes up towards the end of the book, where you, in kind of wrapping up your discussion of the Brand New Nation, talk about the fact that, these global capital flows that we're discussing, they are seen to be the promise that activates India's old civilizational glory and is going to somehow renew its cultural nationalism in the 21st century, right? And I was reflecting on this in the context of today's politics, where there is clearly, it seems to me, a tension on the one hand between the ruling BJP and their branding agents on the one hand, and organizations like the RSS, the Sangh Parivar, its affiliates, who maintain a more nativist orientation. And you can see the push and pull of this discussion and dialogue in government policymaking. But if this brand new nation is to continue in the way in which it has developed over the last, say, quarter century or more, how stable is this equilibrium given the fact that the ruling party does have these two very different constituencies that it has to please? It has to please a more market-oriented, globalization-friendly, investor-friendly middle class. On the other hand, it has a ideological cadre-based organization that is very powerful. You and I both know that at the end of the day, it is really the latter that is what goes out and wins you elections, right? And so how do you think about how the current dispensation navigates this territory?
I think one thing that we have already been speaking about is that in surprising ways, the flow of global capital has also re-energized the nationalist feelings. And that was already there during the Congress time also, except the difference was that one was speaking about nationalism, but nationalism in terms of a secular nation. Right. So that begins to shift sometimes, under the current ruling party. But what I'm also trying to argue is that, what at first seems like a contradiction between a very liberal, ideology and expressions of illiberalism, which, like you point to the nativist notions, actually, in surprising ways, they somehow are re-energized. That's what I'm trying to show, the revitalization of the homeland, that more money flows in, more it is interpreted as a reaffirmation of the nation's cultural essence, that, that we are the productive, people. I mean, pay attention to the fact that when Mr. Modi went to World Economic Forum, I think 2 years ago, then he made his speech, like a lot of people were very puzzled that he wasn't actually speaking much of economic policy. At the World Economic Forum, he's actually speaking about Indian civilizational culture. He's speaking about the greatness of India. I remember a lot of commentators were deeply puzzled that why is this even happening? The point is, here you have a captive audience, which is the world's movers and shakers, who are present basically because they see India as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity. They don't care for much else. But at the same time, Mr. Modi then captures that opportunity to speak about India's cultural essence, right? So I think in that sense, what is important is that what kind of bargain is being made and how capital becomes a fuel which can be channeled in many different ways. But in this case, it has been channeled to re-energize what would at first seem the, nativist forces, in this case, Hindu nationalism, right? So I think this is where the liberal, illiberal categorization, which we have become familiar with, they don't make sense, because liberal economy can perfectly cohabit space with illiberal, politics. So I think this is the thing, because I think, the triumph of liberalism, we were told that all freedoms go together, or liberalism, it stirs up, liberal economy will stir up. It has not happened neither in China, nor in Russia, nor in many other places in the world. So I think this is what we need to accept, that liberal and illiberal categories can coexist.
My guest on the show today is Ravinder Kaur. She's the author of the book Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs in 21st Century India. Here's what John Komaroff of Harvard had to say about the book. He calls it a tour de force of the changing trajectory of the nation state, specifically its transformation from a liberal democratic polity into a business enterprise underpinned by the neoliberal faith in the capacity of markets to produce utopic futures. Ravinder, this was a fabulous book. I was really heartened to see it on Martin Wolf's best of list. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and good luck with the rest of the book release.
Thank you so much.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting producing platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jonathan Kay. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Maya Krishna Rogers is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.